trying to figure out what comes next on trade policy, I think. I don't think it can, I think probably the table is not where they can live for right now. But then within Africa, we also have a number of challenges that we've been talking about, how to really do regional integration well, how to deal with food insecurity. And I think that cross-cutting all of these discussions is how to really make all of this by Africa and for Africa. As this goes forward, it has to really be something that's going to work for Africa and not be something that's imposed from the outside. And so I think that turning then to the policy environment, I just want to set the stage a little bit, and then I'll turn to our fantastic panel for the discussion. Just a little bit of background on the work that I do, which is tied into this. I'm working with Transform Africa, and Lynette is actually a partner with us in the Hewlett Foundation on Transform Africa, and she'll talk much more about the NEPAD Business Foundation's role in Transform and what it is and how it's working. But one of the pieces that I'm working on very closely is a demand-driven approach to trade. And demand-driven comes up, I think it's come up already in the discussions, it comes up a lot in development circles, but it's not always the way that trade policy works. Trade policy sometimes works from the top down instead of from the bottom up. And I think that as we're in this challenging time right now and trying to figure out what the way forward is, and also trying to figure out how all of this can really work well for development for Africa, we do need to go from the ground up. And this concept of demand-driven is not, it's sort of a market approach, I guess, if you will. I mean, demand is all the supply on the other side. So it's both assessing what the needs and the demands are on the ground, assessing what the market wants, and I think that has come up in a lot of our conversations already. So identifying very specific opportunities that really have potential and what the barriers are that stand in the way of those opportunities, and then figuring out how policy can be tailored to help facilitate those opportunities. That's the kind of demand-driven approach that I think that we need, which is very, very tied into how the market really works. And if we do this, I think that we can also figure out how to do whole of government well. I think that we can figure out how to have policies that are coordinated across spheres. One of the things, we talked about whole of government, we talked about policy coordination this morning, and I think that we need to keep going out of the baskets of trade policy and aid policy and investment policy and trying to link those things together. I also think that, and this is what the panel I think today will really set up very well, as we talk about markets, we're really talking about a whole system that starts at the local national level. And obviously, since we're all here to talk about regional integration, the regional piece is so critically important, and it really is the missing link, I think, that we need to be focusing on. And then making sure that on the international level that the policies reinforce these other markets instead of working against them. One example, and I don't mean to pick on Europe, but an example came up this morning in one of the questions about the economic partnership agreements. And that's actually something we've done a lot of work on at the German Marshall Fund. And while the economic partnership agreements are being done with some of the regional communities in Africa, the analysis of them shows that instead of facilitating regional trade, they can actually undermine regional trade. And I think that kind of thing is exactly what we need to be thinking about as we're setting up policies to make sure that they really have the effects that they're intended to, and not effects that are going to be really detrimental over the long run. So I will turn to the panel now to set this issue up and to talk about the different aspects of this. We're really lucky today to have this panel and to have some visitors, actually. Lynette Chen, the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation. I'll just give a few highlights since you have the bios, and they're all very impressive and long. Lynette has worked extensively in the private sector with Hewlett-Packard. She has really led a lot of work coordinating the voice of the private sector, which, as we all know, is a critical component to making all of this work, making markets work. So Lynette will tell us. We'll talk about the NEPAD Business Foundation, as I mentioned, Transform Africa, and how to really take this demand-driven approach that I've just touched on and make it work in real life, because I think that this has to be something that's tied to the private sector and is implemented by the private sector. So Lynette will lead us through that. We will then turn to Anne Mababu, who is the Director for Market Access Program at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, otherwise known as AGRA, which I'm sure many of you know. She also has had an incredible amount of experience working in the agricultural sector across all fronts, and I'll just mention that she was the CEO of the Eastern African Grain Council as well. So she really brings a lot to the table, and she's going to talk about how the smallholder farmer is tied into systems, which is one of the things that Lynette will also touch on, since that's a big focus of ours with Transform Africa, how to tie smallholder farmers into commercial systems around the corridors as a framework. So Anne will talk about how to integrate smallholder farmers who are often left outside of markets into all of this, and how to make sure that a policy environment, as we think about it, reflects the needs of the smallholder farmer. And then Charlotte Haberbrand will talk about some of the international pieces of this, and in particular we'll focus on a topic that has come up a lot today, no surprise, customs and trade facilitation, and how to get that aspect of this right. Charlotte is the Chief Executive of the International Food and Agriculture Trade Policy Council, or IPC, one of the co-sponsors of the event. And she has also worked, which is where I first met her, with the European Commission. So I'm sorry for picking on the European Commission. As their advisor on international development, agriculture, and trade, has worked at Brookings, so also has had a very extensive career in trade policy and agricultural policy. So we will then turn to questions. I think we've got about an hour, and I'll turn it over to Lynette.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. My name's Lynette Chen. I am a lot of people look at me and wonder, what is this Chinese-looking person running an African organization? So just to explain my heritage, I'm a third generation born in South Africa. And incidentally, quite interestingly, my grandfather from my dad's side landed in Mozambique, in Lorenzo Marx those days, and actually had a banana plantation. So it's quite strange how the cycle has brought me back into agriculture after 2 generations. Anyway, I'm going to give it a bit of a background. Can I just see by a show of hands how many people know what NEPAD is? Okay, well then, that's fantastic. I'm really impressed by that, because I know that from in other international communities, there's been a lot of debate around NEPAD, a lot of skepticism about what has NEPAD delivered, and I'm actually here to tell you that there is a lot of work that is going on, and it has progressed extremely well. So just to give you an idea of the structures, to explain where does the NBA fit in, because a lot of people get us confused with the NEPAD Secretariat. The NEPAD structures, as you know, is a program of the African Union, and recently, as recent as 2 weeks ago, at the AU Heads of State Summit, there was an agreement that the NEPAD would be integrated into the African Union structures, and the NEPAD Steering Committee is now called the NEPAD Planning and Coordination Agency, the NPCA. So that's a new development, and their focus will be on program coordination and delivery with partners, and a lot of the policy and regulatory issues will be taken up at the AU level, which I think makes a lot of sense, because then you have all 53 member states of the AU fully buying into NEPAD and fully buying into these policy frameworks that we've all highlighted that is critical, that there is a continental perspective on these things. Where the NBF, as NEPAD Business Foundation, comes in 2002, our president at the time, President Mbeki, asked South African private sector to come together to support NEPAD, because if it is to serve as the strategic framework for social and economic development in Africa, you need private sector involved. And it's a massive program, and government cannot do it by themselves. And so we started as a voluntary group of business people sitting around the table trying to work out what is this NEPAD ideology and how do we make it practical, because as you know, business always wants to see return on investment and measurements and deliverables. And so we bring in a very practical approach where we get involved in the delivery of projects on NEPAD. And so we're working closely with the NEPAD Secretariat, or the NPCA, who has the responsibility to formulate the continental strategies on agriculture, ICT, etc. What we do is bring private sector support, expertise, skill, knowledge, resources to actually deliver on those projects. And so we have a couple of projects that have been very successful. We are a non-profit organization, and we are funded completely by our private sector, and we're membership-based. And so our members constitute about 50 to 60 companies. Some of them are large corporates as well as SMEs. What we then tasked these CEOs or the voluntary group of business people to do is go back into the industry sectors and to form working groups. And so we have, for example, the agribusiness sector that is led by the Agriculture Business Chamber in South Africa, energy is headed by Eskom, and legal headed by one of our leading law firms. And so these working groups within each of them over the last 4 to 5 years have come up with fantastic projects. One of them, for example, in the ICT sector, which I'm quite close to because I used to work for Hewlett-Packard for 8 years, we were involved in the NEPAD eSchools project, which connected 100 schools in 16 African countries. And that is really to demonstrate the power of NEPAD, where you would not have had 16 countries working on a one school project. Under CADIP, you would not have all these countries working towards one agricultural strategy for Africa. And so I think that the power of NEPAD has certainly proven itself. We play a central role of facilitation and coordination between private sector, governments, as well as the regional economic communities, focusing primarily on SADC, as well as with the donors and DFIs. And so what we find is trying to get the right people and the right stakeholders around the table means that everyone is working towards the same goals, which has not necessarily happened. So just as a quick overview, these are the programmatic focus areas of NEPAD. And the NBF's mission and vision, as I've already stated, our strategic objective is to coordinate and facilitate activities across industry sectors to be a catalyst for NEPAD-related business opportunities. And so from private sector's view, it's not to see Africa or African projects as simply CSR and philanthropy, but to understand that inherent in these NEPAD programs is massive business opportunities, all these billions of dollars of infrastructure that needs to be built. There are very innovative ways to get involved. And also to look at sustainable projects and incorporate and ensure that there is social development in all of these, and as well, which includes capacity building and SME development. I'm going to quickly talk about the Transform Africa initiative. I think that we all know these statistics on agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa, where African agriculture has underperformed. There's inadequate infrastructure, poor productivity, poor government policies, and unequal terms of trade. However, due to global trends and improved policy, there's a lot of attention being focused in Africa at the moment. And as you can, from Paul's presentation, the development corridors really emanated from the scramble for mineral resources in Africa, and then the mines having to build infrastructure around to support their businesses and all these other economic development activities flourishing along that infrastructure. The second big scramble in Africa right now is for agriculture and for land, and it's coming from all sides. And so one of the issues that we discussed with my colleagues from ADB and the AU was how do we develop African policies on agricultural investment, responsible agricultural investment, so that Africans are not left on the roadside looking at everything that's being shipped out of Africa. Also, the way that there's a shift in fundamentals defining the future of African agriculture. We all know that the growth of the world population will lead to an increase in demand for food. There's emerging regional and domestic markets. So when you're looking at addressing not one country on its own, but addressing the whole region of SADC, for example, your market opportunities is far larger. And there is a new class of agricultural entrepreneurs emerging, which is really where Transform Africa is focused on. So when you look at the evolving structure of African agriculture, traditionally you've had on the left-hand side subsistence farming or smallholder farming. And traditionally, as we know, 80% of Africa's agriculture is produced by the subsistence farmers. But this has been really a donor-focused approach, where there's a lot of aid coming in to help train and get the farmers to produce. But there is often, that's where the donor assistance stops. There's no lead into the markets. There's no introductions into the commercial value chain. On the right-hand side, you have large commercial farms that are being very successful. They have high returns, and their integration of small farm engagement has traditionally been more of a defensive approach rather than encouraging, because of them perceiving this to be costly. Those large commercial farms are focused on maximizing their production for profit, and so having to engage with smallholder farmers has been a challenge. What we're seeing in the middle part is what we call transformative agriculture, where you see a entrepreneurial, opportunistic, small to mid-sized commercial farms. They're very growth-orientated, and they have a lot of flexibility in terms of new markets that they want to explore. And so what we're doing in Transform Africa is focusing on this transformative agriculture, looking for those agricultural entrepreneurs that can engage the smallholder farmers. For example, if you have a cashew nut farmer that maybe has a couple of thousand hectares of land, he needs to increase his outputs, and so he will then engage with the smallholder farmer community, provide them with some input, some support, and agree to buy the offtake. As his own operation grows, he needs to start looking at manufacturing production for export purposes, and Transform Africa will invest in those projects as well. And at the end of the line, sorry, I was talking to this slide. At the end of the line, we are also working with the market and retailers, which are the large supermarket chains, the breweries, etc. So we're addressing agriculture along the whole value chain. So there's two components to Transform Africa. There's the Transformation Fund, which is being set up at the moment. It will be based in South Africa and managed, the fund managers is a group called Lions Head Growth Partners. And we are looking at setting this up as a $50 million fund, and will invest into small to medium-sized agribusiness enterprises, as well as processing and beneficiation. As I mentioned before, they will integrate smallholder farmers to become more commercially sensitized, and at the end we're also working with the retailers. Where the NBF comes in is that we have been appointed by Transform Africa to be the local implementation partners, and so there's a lot of softer issues that the farmers face on a day-to-day basis that just by investing money into the farm doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful. So there's a lot of issues around them understanding the policy and regulatory issues, stakeholder engagement across sectors, and even with the smallholder farmers, infrastructure, capacity development. And so NBF will come in to provide support and assistance to these farmers to make sure that they are not feeling isolated. Often, if they're battling with a policy issue, they don't know or get any support from their governments. And because NBF is strategically placed and we have good relationships with the country governments and the agricultural institutions, we can provide a lot of support and recommendations on policy interventions. And so just really looking at, again, the two parts of Transform Africa, removing the barriers, we are looking at market and providing market insight on what policies will need to be developed. Because we're working closely with the farmers, we understand what their needs and challenges are, and build capacity to deploy these policies, and that means working with the regional economic communities and the local government officials to provide them support. Promote corridors to aid the rollout, and then work to align the efforts of others, including the donor agencies and DFIs. And on the investment side, it's going to operate as an investment fund, but also bringing donor projects to the market. So how the structure is going to work, the Hewlett Foundation has provided the NBF with some seed funding. We've received a planning grant to really set this up. And it's going to be a learning relationship. And it's really to understand what do the farmers and agribusinesses need in order to grow. And then I've explained already the investment fund, 50 million target. It's across a value chain, and there will definitely is that there's a smallholder business component incorporated into the business plans. So these are some of the impacts. Direct impact: the small farmers will have a benefit via income, security, skills. There's employment creation on the farms, off-farm entrepreneurial business employment creation, more affordable business, better staple foods, foreign exchange, savings and earnings, and net local and global environmental benefits. Indirect, we will demonstrate pro-agriculture development of corridors, and that this can have a major and positive effect on poverty. Transformative investments in agriculture are good commercial bets. Invest and demonstrate investment platforms that can create and generate commercial returns and diffuse institutional mechanisms. So I know these are actually some of Paul's slides. So being South African, I've borrowed them from him. We are focusing a lot of our efforts on these development corridors, and so I will tell you a little bit more about the pilot corridor, which is the Biro corridor. As Paul mentioned, it's a private sector-led initiative. We are also focused on the Kala corridor and the Central corridor. So the Biro corridor, as you can see, goes from Mozambique, Malawi, and into Zimbabwe. And we've seen that one as well. There's a lot of anchor investments that are taking place. There's huge mining activity in Tet province here in the north. There are 3 new major mines that are coming online in the second half of this year and the first half of the next year, which has already shown that there's a lot of shops, hotels, retail opportunities that is growing around the Tet area. We are also working with the Mozambican government on setting up a capacity building training centre in Tet that will train the employees that will work for the mines. And we already have a database of 24,000 local Mozambicans with different levels of skills. And if the mine comes to us and said we need 1,000 welders, we have a database of who's qualified. And those who need to have a bit of an upgrade of skills, we will be training them as well. So it will be a sustainable project and has endorsement of the Mozambican government. So the Biro corridor is a potential breadbasket region, and my chairman likes to say that agriculture is a huge opportunity for Africa because it has the potential to turn Africa from being perceived as the basket case of the world into the breadbasket of the world. And I really do believe that will hold true in the next 10 to 20 years. When you look at Biro corridor, there's virtually no commercial agriculture there today. There's 10 million hectares of arable land, very, very fertile soil, of which 1.4 million is smallholder farming, 25,000 of hectares is commercial farming, with most of it being made up by sugarcane, which is a South African company that's in there at the moment, Illovo Sugar. And then only 1,200 hectares is irrigated. So huge potential that exists. If you look at if you look at the slide, there are 4 major zones in Chimoya, Tet. They're also looking at building an airport there, and then in Manica as well. If you look at the type of infrastructure that currently exists, there's major power lines going through there. There's one rail link from Tet to Beira. And the Biro port at the moment is not able to cope with the capacity, so that needs to be upgraded. Infrastructure is essential, as we've said before, and this is another version of understanding the trunk infrastructure and the feeder road system, as well as electricity reticulation that is going to be required. So, as I've always said, agriculture cannot happen in isolation. You need the water, you need the electricity, the road infrastructure, and of course there's a lot of community development that happens as well. And so what is going to be needed to stimulate new major investments? If you look at the number of new farms per year, it's quite impressive. The projections are that you will have a huge growth in medium-sized farms of 300 hectares, each, and then also huge potential in terms of livestock and field crops. So there are a couple of projects. The Biro Corridor Group undertook a study over the last, 6 months to understand what kind of farming activity is currently in the area and what kind of infrastructure exists. And so obviously trying to determine the direct linkages between infrastructure and agriculture. And so there are a couple of these projects been identified as ready to go. There's huge banana plantations, citrus, honey production plants. And so if the infrastructure is put in place, what we can see is that the opportunity by 2030 can go from looking to a couple of agriculture opportunities to major agriculture investment and opportunities. So having said that, the Biro Corridor requires $106 million for on and off farm infrastructure between 2010 and 2015, which is a massive amount. The government doesn't necessarily have the money, and so we have to come up with innovative ways of how we can raise this funding. Currently, the funding model will look to secure grants to get some of these projects started, approach the DFIs like the ADB, the DBSA, etc., and then also private sector. And so a funding model has been designed, and we are currently refining that as well. Coming to the regional integration issues and trade barriers, Paul did cover that, so around connecting the missing links. The idea is that we need to foster increased intra-Africa trade. There is huge potential when, we could buy coffee beans from across the border at a fraction of the cost of what we get it back imported. And so there is a large, in terms of regional integration, a large drive from the regional economic communities to make sure that these missing links enable that. The other barrier is at the border posts, customs and immigration. We know from our member companies, we have a large logistics company called Imperial Logistics, and they ship a lot of the fish produce from South Africa into the rest of Africa. They don't stop complaining about the logistical issues and the hold-ups at the border posts. On the South African border, you have these lovely big scanners that can scan the containers. When you get to the Zimbabwe side, your truck could be held up there for 10 days because somebody has to come and count things manually. And so the idea of the one-stop border post is that governments will cooperate in having one standardized form, one clearing agent, and one customs official that will clear the truck and that it can move across with ease. There are a couple of pilots being done at the moment on the one-stop border posts, and also so there will be the work that is being done will be very interesting to see the results. One of the propositions, because I put it out back to my members, to the logistics companies, and said, well, if you're experiencing all the problems, what do you think will actually work? And I actually proposed this to a couple of the ministers of trade and industry at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town last year, where there was the Minister of Trade and Industry for South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique. And I said, the private sector said that we would like to take over the management of the border posts, where the government can take and maintain control over the customs and immigration, but really just the processing of the forms, training of the staff, etc. We could enter into an innovative PPP where the private sector could actually run these centres. And one minister said absolutely not. The second minister from Mozambique said, for a great idea, I wouldn't have a problem doing a 5-year concession with the private sector company to do that. And our minister, Mr. Rob Davey, said, that's interesting, come and talk to me. So I think that it has to take a big mind shift within the governments. But this is what NEPAD provides. It's new innovations on how to work together with governments. And also the governments will benefit because it stops the bribery. They get the royalties every month. The government officials are not there to take the bribes. And it also makes private sector, reduce the cost of private sector in terms of transaction costs a lot lower. The other main barrier is visas. I know from South Africa to go to Angola, you still need to get a visa, and it can take anything up to 3 to 4 weeks, and it costs 1,200 Rand, which for us is a lot of money. And so how are we going to, in trying to create regional integration, have these visa issues? Traveling on South African passport is actually a nightmare, and we were actually one of the luckier countries. So even between our own African regions, it's a problem. Talking about also then the SADC free trade areas, there was a lot of discussion earlier about how do we go about that. The SADC free trade areas was launched by the SADC Secretariat in 2008. You can take goods across borders at zero tariffs, depending on your certificate of origination. They've also set up a website where you can report non-tariff barrier issues. So you can report inefficiencies at the border posts, etc. And it's all great, but I would like to really do a review on the implementation part of this, because I know that there are still some issues. And so it's all good in theory, and I think the governments and the secretariats, the regional economic units are working very hard to harmonise this, but the implementation always falls down. And it comes back to one of the points around capacity building. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynette. That was wonderful. That was a great way to build on the presentation of this morning. We all admire Paul's slides, so you're not the only one. But I think that, I think it's a great segue into... Thank you for giving us some very concrete ways, too, in which the private sector and government can cooperate more closely, because I think that's one of the big questions that's being raised this morning. And and we appreciate your insight in that area. And also then, thank you for mentioning the need for capacity building and how to really build these markets all along the value chain. And in that, I'll turn to Anne, who's going to go into that in even more detail.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And most of my work is done. The speakers who talked in the two sessions have addressed the key issues that impede smallholder farmers to accessing markets. And as we look at the policies, Lynette has already talked about the policies that are in place. Infrastructure is one of the biggest problem that we have. So I'll quickly go through what the farmers are going through. I've decided to focus on one food commodity, and that is the biggest item traded in the East and Southern Africa, and that is maize, or the cereals. Here comes in the issue of the importance on staples. If you look in Africa, they contribute 51% of the calories, and the main staples in this region we are talking about of maize, rice, wheat, beans, sorghum, and millet. And here lies what we are talking about. These are low-value commodities. It's not like coffee or cashew nuts or pigeon peas are even having a higher value. So the margins are very small. If the transaction costs are high, these farmers end up not being able to access the markets that can reward them. So if I take the importance or the commodities, the way they are traded, maize account for about 15% of the calorific value. Cassava, and this is very important, especially for Mozambique, Tanzania, and most of West African countries, cassava contributes 12%. Rice is now growing, it's now more than 9%, while sorghum is, and millet 8%. But they are very major in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. When we look at maize, and I'll be talking more about the cereals and focusing on maize, maize has become a political crop in our region. If there is no maize, and even if we are given anything else, we say we don't have food. So what happens? The government comes up and sets up issues on how you can trade on the maize. We find on the policy side, the governments are still playing a major role on the price setting. You wake up, there is no evidence based on what basis they use to give a price. They just wake up and say, oh, okay, the maize price is going to be 1,000 shillings per bag, and there's no evidence what is happening in the regional markets. There's no discussion on import parity, what your customers are also ready to pay. So we end up you take one step forward and two backwards because of this price setting and so unpredictable. You don't know. If at all they could say a season in advance, you would decide whether to plant or not. Then comes in levies in the country, across the countries, duties, import and export bans, and as I said, fixing the producer prices. When it comes to import and export, you wake up in the morning and you are told there is no more maize that is going to move between or from Tanzania to Kenya or from Kenya to Tanzania. That brings in a lot of problems. You are a farmer in Tanzania, you had a contract with a buyer in Kenya, and all of a sudden you had your 2,000 or 5,000 acres already done. He gave you the inputs, he financed the whole thing, and then the government says the food cannot go across. So these are some of the issues. Then you have to go back to the government, you have to plead and go show your contracts and how it affects the whole relationship. It's quite a nightmare. And this is one of the areas when we talk of policies, it's not just the trade, it's also the government playing a major role in fixing the prices. Also, we realize there is very reduced investment in R&D and also on production, and a major challenge on how farmers are to market their produce because of the poor infrastructure. And I won't talk about the infrastructure. I think it was very well covered by all the speakers this morning. The issue of market information systems and lack of grades and standards. Farmers do not know what the prices are. they have to go to the market, and that's when they'll know what the price is. Right now, there is a lot of improvement using cell phones, whereby farmers can text and find out what the prices are and decide whether they are going to sell in that market or not. The most item now pulling us back is grades and standards. Grade 1 maize in Kenya doesn't mean the same in Ethiopia. It's not the same in Tanzania or in Uganda. So as a processor, and we are trying to encourage the private sector to be the link between the farmers and the production. When they say they want grade 1 maize, they don't know what they are going to get. So here comes the issue of requirement to harmonize grades and standards, especially of major staples that are traded across the countries. And COMESA, SADC, and the East Africa Community are working together, all aligned to CADAP, and they're trying to bring in harmonized grades and standards so that you can then be able to deposit your produce in warehouse receipt. And that then when you are told is grade 1, you can buy the receipt when you are in the other country. You don't need to see the samples. These are some of the issues that are affecting the access to markets. I need to say that we are really not dead. The sector is getting organized, but we are not there yet. What leads to all this? I think poverty has a major impact on this. If you take 85% of the staples in our region are grown by smallholder farmers, and this is actually for the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa, not just for the Eastern and Southern Africa. The farmers do not know, they don't have the good agronomy, so this leads to low productivity. Obviously, that leads to low incomes, and most of them cannot afford to buy certified seeds and fertilizers, and their yields will probably be 1/3 of what other people are able to get. Again, many farmers are not able to generate enough surpluses to market. Or if they do, you have one farmer with 2 bags, the other guy with 5. And the private sector is saying, I can go house to house. Can you organize these guys, aggregate the volumes, store it, fumigate it, get it in a consignment that is economical? Then I'll be able to send my truck to pick 300, 500 metric tons. All these are the issues that you've got to address if you are to link the smallholder farmers to the SMEs and the big processors. And at the end of the day, because our farmers have no money, they sell during the season. At that time, that's the time the prices are very low. Then they go back to the market 45 or 2 months, 2 months afterwards to buy the produce at exorbitant prices. So they end up being net buyers of cereals, and brings in the vicious cycle of poverty in the region. If I compare why we are bringing in the protectionism policies, if I look at the disposable incomes spent on food, in the US, a study shows you spend 7.2% of your income on food. In Canada, 9%, India, 33%, and in Africa, we are spending 75%. And this is why I thought I focus on staple foods. Because if we are going to spend 75% of our incomes on food, it means you really have nothing for savings or for any investments. The problems are known. I think I won't go very much into infrastructure. It has been discussed, but high transport costs for both goods and services. Quickly looking at a study that was done in 2003, Ethiopia, they spend 54% on the value of the cost of their produce goes into marketing costs on transport. Malawi, 37%, and that's huge. Then these guys, I think this maize has to be packed in, be partially gold to be able to sell afterwards and get something. These are issues that the private sector and the governments can be able to actually participate and bring a bit of savings to the farmers. Inadequate storage, we have already talked about the high post-harvest losses, and I'm very happy to hear African Development Bank is also focusing on this area. How to store the produce, especially at home level. You end up having a lot of farmers storing their small produce. They don't have the drying facility, so they haven't dried it. And we end up with the growth of mycotoxins, and a few cases have been reported of deaths from aflatoxin poisoning, and that took place in Kenya a few years back. Lack of market information we have talked about. Lack of value addition. very little value addition being done at the farm level on food commodities. Again, a very fertile ground for investment in by SMEs and also private sector. We have talked about the unpredictable policy environment, and trade policies we have gone through. Lynette talked about cross-border. This is the state of our cross-border trade. The customs, she said about everybody having, even when the duty is zero on food commodities, everyone is asking for something under the table. So all these guys with bicycles are just trying to avoid going through the customs checkpoint. And again, you come with a truck, you offload, and then you go across the border, you load it back. All this increases the transaction costs, and what happens? The farmers are the ones who end up suffering most. Grades and standards and uneconomical volumes, this is what you find when you go to the market. Most of these sets, most of the food, if it's not sold within a day or two, it also goes to waste. Setting up agribusiness centers where some of this produce can be processed. Either for fruits could be going into jam or juices, vegetables could be dehydrated, but at the end of the day, you find most of the stuff goes into waste. A fertile ground again for investment potential. This is how we trade. You need to move your produce through all these borders, and in every border you are stopping, you are taking a day or two to go through customs. The food is not able to move from the surplus areas to the deficit areas. One of the issues, the trade barriers, infrastructure is one of the main one. And at the end of the day, we find it's cheaper to bring food from South Africa into Kenya than buying from southern Tanzania into Kenya. Mainly infrastructure and also the customs issues. This is what we should be working towards, food and trade flow without borders. So, and this is the only way the farmers will grow. This is the only way we will improve the livelihoods of our farmers, if they can be able to take advantage of the facilities and the trade and markets available to them. And this is where now AGRA comes in to try to bring in some interventions to help these farmers to access the markets. We have a program going back on a value chain intervention on seed systems, and I talked about the farmers not using seeds. Here we come in with the seeds and bringing the seeds closer to the farmers, close to agro dealers. Some farmers used to move about 50 kilometers to buy a bag of fertilizer or seeds. And with the intervention with 6,000 agro dealers, most farmers now do not walk more than 4 to 5 kilometers to get their produce. And we are still trying to bring the distance shorter and shorter so that they can be able to access the inputs. Soil health program that works on organic and inorganic fertilizers, and also agronomy, teaching the farmers how to use these inputs. We have talked about the policy issues. We have a policy program that works on policy development and also trying to bring access to credit. And markets is what we've been talking all along. So with the increased productivity and having now addressed the issues of storage, market information, grades and standard value addition, we can then be able to link the farmers closer to the buyers, because the buyers at the end of the day want organized farmers. By this, we achieve this by reducing the transaction costs, bringing in private sector and the SMEs to do the value addition, and also some farmer organizations, FBOs, are able now to do value addition, but they need support to be able to produce enough or the right quality that the market wants. Alternative uses in going into animal feed, going into breweries or into industrial usage, and enabling environment, addressing the policy issues. Our approach is link the farmers direct to the buyers and to the top of the supply chain. That way you cut the middlemen. Then the incomes can be able to accrue to the margins can accrue to the farmers. Develop the market so that agriculture can be commercialized. And the storage and services, we have talked about the need for addressing the storage facilities. And our aim is ultimately to improve the commercial food flow, move the food from surplus to deficit areas as conveniently and economically as possible, improve trade nationally and regionally, and stabilize the prices through warehouse receipt systems, commodity exchanges, and ultimately better incomes for the farmers and increased food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I think that was an incredibly valuable addition to the excellent presentations we've already heard. And you did such a beautiful job illustrating the situation facing smallholder farmers and the impact that these barriers have all along the value chain and why the markets are so incredibly important. So thank you for that. And I think that your slide on what happens at the border was one that was particularly, gripping for all of us. I could see everybody in the crowd sort of, really lighting up when you did that. So Charlotte, we're going to turn to you now to talk about the customs piece of this and how it can work better and why it's so particularly important.
Thank you.
Sorry to start this slideshow. Just click on the first one.
Just go view, top view, and then slideshow.
Thanks. Well, I have the somewhat unenviable task of being the last speaker in a full day, and on top of that, to talk about customs facilitation. I mean, can it get any worse than that? Just a very brief, I want to thank the Wilson Center very much for hosting us and thank the partnership and GMF for partnering with IPC on this conference. We have a lot of trade and a lot of Africa experts in this room, so I am going to be brief. I'm going to introduce the topic of trade facilitation, and then I hope we can learn from each other during the Q&A. So first of all, what is trade facilitation? I think we can think about it broadly and in a more narrow fashion. Broadly, it's really everything that is required to make trade happen. So it includes all the things we've been talking about today: infrastructure, public sector modernization, economic development, all the border measures, including, of course, tariffs, quotas, export restrictions, but also some of the non-tariff barriers, whether that's in the SBS or TBT realm. Now, the more narrow definition, and this is the one that's been adopted in the WTO, which I'll come to talk about a little bit later, is really, if you will, sort of more the nitty-gritty of what happens at the border. And I think Lynette and Anne have actually done a very good job of explaining what some of those things are. But essentially, these are all the things that happen, lots of paperwork involved about being able to move products across borders. So just to go through some of them, what do we mean by undertaking trade facilitation? The first one is very simply to simplify and reduce documentation requirements. So some examples here of what countries might do if they want to simplify these requirements. They could, for example, accept commercially available documentation rather than requiring a whole separate set of documentation. They could live with authenticated copies rather than original documents. They could use international standards rather than have their own standards. I think Lynette raised the very important issue of having a single window. This is sort of a one-stop shop for learning about all the customs and trade requirements. Right now, in many African countries, you have some 20 to 30 different parties involved in a border transaction. So if you offer a one-stop shop, it really makes it easier for the exporter and the importer to move products across borders. So this is, if you will, the whole of government approach at the border that really needs to take place. Very important within the RECs, within the regional economic communities, is that you have harmonized documentation across all the borders. It's fine and good to have, to agree to lower your tariffs, but if you're not doing the same thing at the border, that really won't do you any good. So COMESA, for example, has done some very interesting work on this that has really helped to facilitate movement across the border. The second topic here, enhanced transparency and reduced levels of fees. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Thirdly, simplify and expedite release and clearance of goods from customs. I would add here that this is especially important for agricultural products that are perishable. So the longer time that things are held up at the border, the more you're actually jeopardizing food security and adding to that very large figure of food that's being wasted in Africa. The other enhanced transparency and predictability of trade-related regulations, and again, improved border agency coordination within and across countries. Also touched on that already. So why does trade facilitation matter? These are some figures that I got from it's actually not the most recent report, the World Bank Doing Business report. I think this is the 2008 report. And it's interesting, and remember that these are just averages. So what we're looking at here is we're comparing Sub-Saharan Africa and OECD countries on the export and the import side. How many documents are required for a transaction? How many days does it take to clear customs? And the costs here are, it's the costs per a 20-foot container. So I actually was a little bit surprised that on the document side, I would have expected a greater disparity between the two regions. But I think it's important to emphasize these are averages. So you will find, of course, in some countries, much higher number of documents required for customs. The days, I think it's pretty telling. There's a huge gap there, both on the export and the import side, and on the financial figures as well. Now, you could argue that this, is really just something that's sort of a nuisance for the people that are actually trying to move the products across border. And so what if they have to wait a few extra days, or if they have to pay a little extra? At the end of the day, maybe they can simply pass it on to their consumers. So maybe it's really not such a big deal. And I think, that's tempting maybe to think, but we need to think about all of the indirect costs to an economy of all these inefficiencies at the border. There are definitely wider benefits for the economy. And I think in Africa in particular, what would be very useful if we could do more facilitation of customs is that you would lower the incidence of informal cross-border trade, which of course is huge. I mean, we always say that regional trade in Africa in agriculture in particular is very low. If you look at informal cross-border trade, it's actually not so low. And you could argue that this informal cross-border trade, especially in food products, is very important for food security. But I think we need to try to actually reduce the amount of informal trade and bring some of that into the formal sector. Just to give you a sense of how important informal exports are, the informal sector itself in Africa makes up 43% of GDP. And if you look at trade, Uganda, for example, did a monitoring survey in 2006 where informal exports to its 5 neighboring countries were 46% of total imports. Of total exports, the exports, or 86% of official exports. A country like Benin, 90% of trade flows are actually informal. So these are basically trade flows that never see a customs official. So why is that problematic? Again, you could argue it's actually a good thing, and because it helps sort of your very small producers and traders to go into business. It also could help food security because it moves food from places of need, from places of surplus to places of need. But again, we talked earlier, I think Anne was the one who said, that the share of government revenue coming from tariffs is very substantial in a lot of these countries. So the more informal trade, obviously, the more you lose some of that government revenue. On average, some 25% of government revenue in Africa comes from tariff revenue. Now, why else is it good to reduce the amount of informal trade? I think it gives us a better handle on what trade is actually taking place. Basically, now we're guessing. In fact, all of the statistics on informal trade are really a bit of guesswork. So if we had a better sense of the trade flows that are actually taking place, it would help really improve also policymaking in all of these countries. So I've just tried to sort of give some reasons why trade facilitation matters beyond those people that are annoyed waiting at the border. Now, well, what does trade facilitation mean for developing countries? I think I've already outlined why it is so important in the African context. The OECD has actually estimated that 2/3 of the gains from trade facilitation globally would go towards developing countries. And I think the reason is obvious. The needs are much greater there. The inefficiencies to be addressed are much greater there. We have to be realistic. There's lots of multiple demands, not to mention infrastructure, but lots of other things as well. So governments have to decide where they're going to put their money. A lot of this stuff that we're talking about, if you want to, for example, set up an automated customs system, it's expensive. So governments do need to think about where they're going to put their money, their limited money. I think this is an area, although it seems kind of daunting, it's been shown that even modest reforms can actually fairly quickly bear results. So Angola, for example, midway through a 5-year customs modernization program, increased its revenue by 150% and reduced its customs procedures to 24 hours. So I think, you know, it looks daunting, but once you start, the benefits are actually quite useful. Let me talk about how trade facilitation actually happens. Lots of times it's basically a government that decides, oh my God, we've got really horrible procedures, we need to really fix this. And then there are lots of institutions that are actually very helpful, the World Bank, IMF, et cetera. And donors, of course, can also work with countries to try to address some of these things. Oftentimes, it's the business community. You know, if you've got a business community that's trying to move things across the borders and they see some of these pictures, they're not going to want to do any business with that country. So, unfortunately, the places where the business community is most successful in triggering trade facilitation are in those sort of bigger emerging economies. So there's a real problem in Africa that you don't necessarily have the business impetus to try to drive some of this change. So the WTO has actually entered this area of trade facilitation, and to me this is quite interesting. It's part of the single undertaking, which is the negotiation on the Doha Development Round. It's one of the important pillars of it. It doesn't get talked about a whole lot, I think in part because it's just not so exciting, again, because it deals with customs facilitation issues. It's not a very typical WTO negotiation. When we think of the WTO members negotiating with each other, we think of very hard bargaining on concessions. You know, you want to lower your tariff here and you're willing to offer this on domestic support. That doesn't really work in trade facilitation. And I think you could argue that this is something that is done. The countries are clearly in it because they realize that there will be benefits to themselves from trade facilitation. Obviously, there's benefits also to their trading partners, but it's not this concession, you know, hard bargaining kind of mindset. The mandate within the WTO on trade facilitation is very strong. It calls for a clarification of some existing GATT articles. And I think very interestingly, and this also makes it unique among WTO negotiations, it talks about any kind of commitments that countries agree to take on trade facilitation will be matched by funding. Again, that's obviously going to be more difficult to work out in reality, but that is in the mandate. And so I think that's very important. And also, if a country at the end of the day does not have the capacity to implement a commitment, it will not have to do it. So I think that's also an interesting approach to negotiations, considering it's within the WTO. Africa is very active in these negotiations. Somebody from the WTO Secretariat told me that they are actually, you know, that countries like Tanzania, Nigeria, and Zambia speak more than the US and the EU combined. That's kind of unusual. It's in part because, again, trade facilitation negotiators are financed to actually participate in the negotiations, which is very important. But I think it also shows that they realize this is a very, very important area for them. It's perhaps one of the sort of bright spots of the WTO negotiations. There's been some progress on the negotiations. There's still lots to be done, but it is a more promising area. I would argue, you know, that the two. It's not something that can be done tomorrow because there are issues about how do you actually match the promise of funding to commitments, and then there's also another issue of dispute settlement in terms of if you make a commitment on trade facilitation but you don't actually meet it, what are some of the legal implications? So happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And I'm closing. Just to say there has been good progress on this. We don't, of course, know what will happen with the Doha round. It's certainly unclear. There will be a stock taking of the negotiations in March, and then we'll see. Again, trade facilitation has actually moved quite well. We'll soon get to a point, I suppose, where we know whether the Doha round can be achieved or not, and then perhaps we'll come back to this topic of early harvest. And trade facilitation has actually been singled out as one area where you could sort of, cherry pick something from the negotiations. And I would argue that's a really good one, along with duty-free, quota-free, and perhaps cotton, because these are really very important development initiatives. And then lastly, the question of alternatives, I would argue the WTO is actually it provides a lot of impetus for all the countries to do this together. I think it'd be kind of a shame to lose this opportunity, and a lot of work has been done. But obviously there will be other ways to do it, but they might be more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you for leading us through that topic, both taking it back to Anne's excellent slide and also painting it in the broader context, which is so important to the conversation we're having today. And thanks also for linking this back up to the WTO, but talking about how there are things that we can really be doing now. Trade facilitation, duty-free, quota-free. As we're waiting for the landscape on trade to sort of play out, there are things that we can be moving forward immediately without waiting for that. So I think we have time for some questions. I'll turn to the crowd. Please identify yourselves and be brief in your questions, and maybe I'll take a couple first, and then we'll turn to the panel to answer. Yes, please, in the second row. I think there are microphones coming around.
My name is Shim. I'm from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My question is to Anne and maybe Charlotte. You mentioned how grain is very important for food security in Africa. But if you look at food prices in Africa, especially maize, I mean, compared to the 2008 peaks, it has come down significantly. But compared to previous, historical standards, it is still very high. And some economists are saying that the reasons or the main contributing factors to the 2008 food crisis are still here. It is because of the financial crisis these prices have come down. So do you see any price spike in the near future? Because, I see these food prices are a big factor, other than the other factors that you mentioned contributing to the well-being of African farmers. Thank you.
Thank you. And right behind you, sir, could you hand the microphone to the... Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Edson PC from the African Development Bank. A couple of questions. We saw quite a number of challenges to trade in Africa, but I must say that Africa is not homogeneous. And in East Africa, there's been a lot of progress within the East African community specifically. I think they've actually reached a customs union where there's, you can move, food products without any tariffs or duties. I don't know, I just want to know over the last couple of years whether you've had any impact in terms especially on flows of food, from food deficit areas to, rather food surplus to food deficit areas. Has there been any impact in terms of increasing in trade within the East African community area? I know, Anne, you're based in Nairobi and you worked with grains. You might have something to say about that, but Lynette as well. Second question on, you mentioned a lot, you mentioned on the farm size. You mentioned a lot on the small-scale farmers. Lynette, you mentioned as well that you're targeting more not the subsistence farmer, but the middle farm. But the definition of the small farm, I think you mentioned a couple of hundred hectares. Really, that's a big farm in Africa.
Yeah.
Most African countries, when you talk of the small farm, the average farming is less than a hectare. So who are we targeting? I know in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Western Kenya, the average farm, parts of Uganda, it's less than a hectare, the average farm. So when we talk of economic growth, there should be some policies for, the farms to target, and also if it's for food security or poverty alleviation, maybe a different size of farm. Just to talk a bit about that.
Thank you very much. And I think I saw, there are several hands. I hope we have time for all of them. Yes.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I'm Kathleen Kurz from the Academy for Educational Development. I'm just, with this and the infrastructure, I just wonder if, it's a big question, but if you could say a few words about what it's most important for the country governments to do, and what, I'm particularly interested in the regional organizations because I work with regional organizations in Africa. And then you can mention the private sector, but I think what do the country governments and the regional organizations need to do to make it possible for the private sector to come in and take advantage of all that we're talking about and say needs to be done.
Thank you very much. I think we should turn to the panel now to answer the questions. That may be all we have time for. Go ahead, I'll let you, who would like to go first? Charlotte?
I could just maybe briefly say something on the question of prices, and I think this is the big question. We all know, of course, that the long-term trend has been downward in commodity prices with occasional peaks. So the question is whether the 2008 price peak was unusual or whether this is something that we're likely to see again. And to me, the answer there really will lie on productivity. I mean, we have ongoing. I think on the demand side, nothing is going to change. I mean, we have incredible demand coming from increased population, and unless the financial crisis has sort of killed off the hope for economic incomes to grow, we'll also have a lot of new demand from improved incomes. The other contributing factor to the price hike was of course biofuels, and I think that's still something to look out for. I think we are correlating a little bit the price of food more than in the past with the price of fuel. So that's I think an important thing to look for. But to the extent that we can increase productivity sufficiently to meet the demand that's out there, then I think we will not sort of continue to see more price spikes. But that's a big question because, as you know, productivity increases have not been what they should be in all parts of the world. So that's why I think it's great that AGRA, for example, is very active on that particular issue.
Okay. On the issues of tariffs, no tariffs between the countries, especially the East African community, have we seen food moving from surplus to deficit? The answer is yes and no. The food would move, but then the policies are still there. You have a lot of production coming, say, from Tanzania, but then there is already a ban from exporting the food to the neighboring countries. So this food doesn't end up reaching. But when it comes to processed products, we are seeing huge increases in trade. So, and this is where the private sector is actually saying this is a good deal. A lot of processed produce is going from Kenya to the neighboring countries, and also from the neighboring countries to all the other markets in the region. But when it comes to staple foods, we have not seen that huge bang that we expected. In fact, we were trying to bring in maize from Malawi into Kenya, but then the prices, the transport element was so high because of poor infrastructure. So they were not competitive. So at the end, the maize had to come from South Africa. So it's a yes, it could happen, but the policies also need to change. But infrastructure also has a major part to play on how much you can move.
Okay, on the question around the size of the farmers, for the Transform Africa initiative, we are targeting not the smallholder farmers. We're targeting really what we call, again, you talk about references small to medium size, but it's farms that are at least 50 plus hectares. And so the idea is that this middle-sized agricultural entrepreneur would then go out and engage the surrounding communities and integrate these smallholder farmers into their production and buy from them. And that's how we will pull in and create this viable smallholder farmer segment, which traditionally have been left on their own and producing for the sake of producing for themselves. The second question around what is most important at a country regional level. I think that, yes, in the past, you'd have the country governments really looking after their national interests. But increasingly, especially over the last 5 years, because of Africa's really double-digit growth in some countries, they're seeing the benefits of regional integration. And so on the infrastructure side, the SADC Ministers of Infrastructure met in Windhoek in 2008 and agreed between all of them which would be the priority corridors. So there are about 7 or 8 priority corridors in the SADC region, and they've agreed to cooperate on them. And the role of the regional and the country governments is, of course, to create an enabling environment for private sector investment. And so, for example, the Walvis Bay Corridor Group has a working committee of government officials from South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. And they meet every 2 to 3 months. And they started off with a list of 40 issues, trade issues. And they've narrowed that down to 24. And so that is a real example of an ideal situation around the corridors. And I think it is working, and there's a lot of modelling and testing going on. And that is why, as I said, NEPAD is very exciting. It's creation of new innovations within Africa.
Thank you very much. I don't think we have time for any more questions, Julie, right? I think we're out of time, aren't we?
Maybe 1 or 2 more if there are burning ones.
Can we do very, very quick questions? I saw your hand up in the back first, so I'm just going where I saw a hand. Yes. The microphone's not on, I don't think.
Quick question to Lynette and Anne. I mean, with Anne's case, the focus is on the smallholder farmer, and the villains in the case are the middlemen, which actually increase the transaction costs. But if we look at but if you look at agriculture in Africa and in the rural development as well, perhaps if we're looking at increasing productivity, maybe we might have to focus not just on the small farmers, but also on the larger, on the more productive farmers. So I'm just wondering, what would be the policy rationale for villainizing the middlemen and focusing on the small farmers to increase productivity in agriculture, when there could be an argument that can be made that the small farmers are not really the productive elements in rural development and agriculture.
Thank you. And then Gabe.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. My name is Gabriel Liza. I'm with the UNFAO. I have one quick comment and one question for Lynette. My comment is, I happen to be from Tanzania. We do love to share our food. There is food in the southern part of Tanzania, but there are people starving on the northern part of Tanzania. And with an election in October, I doubt the president of Tanzania is going to allow the exportation of food. My question to Lynette is 2 quick questions. One is the TFA Transformational Fund. You say you are trying to raise $50 million. How much do you have now, or have you reached your goal? And the second question is on the NBF, the businesses that are involved, are they only from South Africa, or are these businesses from all around Africa?
Okay, I think we'll just turn back to the panel then to respond.
Okay, the question on middlemen and the role of they play, let's not criminalize middlemen. There's a role they play. If there wasn't, there wouldn't be any job for them. But what we are saying is some of the margins that are going to middlemen could actually accrue to the farmers if the farmers themselves did a bit of the value addition. They could dry the produce before they take into the market. They could also be at receive it and not add stones to increase the weight, and aggregate so they have in economic quantities that can be traded. So I say the middlemen have a role to play. It's the level at which they play and what needs to be done. But if you are dealing with, say, a top of the supply chain like World Food Program, it beats any sense to put a middleman again in between the World Food Program and the farmers, if the farmers are already organized and they can meet the specifications of World Food Program. So it's not that we kill one and leave the other. They can both work together, but I think there are areas where the middlemen are required. If the farmers are not organized, then you require the middlemen to go house to house, picking the 2 bags, 1 bag. But if you have farmer groups, FBOs, which we are trying to organize SAGRA, then they should be able to do part of the work themselves. Thank you.
Okay, the question around the Transform Africa model, I'll give an example. There are actually 2 projects that have been invested in Tanzania. One's a barley farm that has an existing offtake agreement with Tanzanian breweries. And so this farmer is a medium-sized farm. He will then go into his communities and engage with the smallholder farmers to say, right, you've got maybe 2 or 3 hectares of land, of which maybe 20 or 30% you're planting subsistence crops. Can I take the other 70% of your land? And they enter into agreements, lease agreements, to either rent or pay them for the usage of their land, provide them with inputs, training, and help them to get organized as small farmer groups, to the point where even that they could even, as a group of small farmers, start renting a tractor for a week, and then they would share the costs between these farmer groups. And the medium-sized farmer then provides them with a lot of that support, so that these smallholder farmers don't have the capital to go and buy a tractor themselves. And so this is a model that's working really well. So there's support, and also in terms of quality and standards, the farmer provides training to the smallholder farmers to say, this is the level of quality that I expect, and there is an existing off-take agreement. So I think that is really the model that we're trying to emulate. And there's definitely space for all of this, and I think it's a really excellent model, because you're then trying to as well not only provide the resources, etc., but also training in terms of how to get these smallholder farmers to become SMEs and become viable SMEs, and they're sustainable because they have an off-take agreement. Talking to the second question around the Transformation Fund, we have been talking to a number of donor institutions, because it's going to be a blend of what we needed was in terms of removing the barriers, which is a softer part. I think that there has been donor funding obviously coming from the Hewlett Foundation. We're also talking to USAID and a number of other institutions. On the fund side, we are also talking to some the development finance institutions, the ADB, the DBSA, IDC, the traditional banks, and even that could also be started or kick-started off with some donor funding. There are obviously institutions like the Soros Foundation and others that have, or the Calvert Foundation, that have put money into investment funds. So we're talking to a whole range of people. We're hoping that the fund will close. This is the first close at $50 million within before the half of the year, and so I hope that answers your question. Regarding NBF members, our membership base, we are based in South Africa. We have a lot of large multinational companies who often base their head offices for Africa in South Africa. So therefore, the work that they do is actually cross-continent. So we have large firms like Deloitte's, KPMG's, Dell, a lot of the US IT companies. But we also have members from neighboring countries like Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. And so the idea is that we want to create hubs of trade, and we're also working with other NEPA business groups. There's a NEPA business group in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and we have MOUs signed with them to increase intra-Africa trade, and that we receive their delegations, and we also send trade missions out to those countries for investment opportunities. Unfortunately, we don't have any contact with East Africa, but the idea is that each hub would have their own private sector lead and develop their own NEPA business groups, because I think that what we want to create is a network of NEPA business groups to increase investment within Africa, and also come up with a combined voice of business for Africa to bring out all the issues and provide input to policy transformation and reform.
Thank you very much, Lynette. Unless Charlotte has anything to add? No. Just to wrap up, clearly there's a lot more to talk about, and so I think that all of us who have sponsored this event really look forward to keeping the discussion going, along with my colleagues at Transform Africa as well. Thank you to IPC in partnership and my colleagues, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for hosting this. I think it's been an excellent conversation. Thank you.
We promised you a very short wrap-up, and you better come join us up here and go to work.
Thanks. Well, I won't speak long. We're over time. I want to say how wonderful it is to see the huge turnout for this event, because we've been working on a number of these events with these same partners and other new ones over the years. For sprinkling of people. So I think this really speaks to the opportunity that's in front of us to really move forward with this whole idea of regional integration in food. I'd like to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to all the panelists, but I'd like to say a special thank you to the panelists who've joined us from our African partner organizations. And I want to say, just like as on the countryside, I think that really has changed the conversation in the U.S. What strikes me as I have been listening this morning is all of a sudden we are no longer talking about, yes, it's important, why is it important, regional integration at that lofty level. All of a sudden, with our partners joining us in the conversation, we have a very much more specific idea of what needs to be done. We have partners on the ground who have been engaged now over years in defining the priorities, and we have folks like NEPAD, CATA, African Development Bank, the business community, who are already there partnering on the ground. So it's easy now, I think, for us to say to the government, please now, let's look at what country-driven and region-driven means in this arena, and how can we deepen this as we've already begun to see on the countryside. We've had the Rwanda discussion. Maybe we need to look at convening a regional discussion to have a better understanding of how the U.S. Can intervene, have a better understanding of what the priorities and how other donor organizations and other multilateral banks are already engaged. But it just really struck me that we have really moved to a different stage of this discussion about regional integration. And now with the willingness from this administration and from Congress to engage, we really have a full agenda, all of our partners, U.S., Africa, multilateral, over the next few years. So thank you all. John?
Let me just say two brief things and then express my thanks to the participants and the partner organizations. The Wilson Center, I think I can speak for Steve McDonald, was very happy to host this situation. It was a fascinating discussion. I suffer a little bit of deja vu all over again because, like my colleague here, I spent a lot of time in the Sahel in that period of time too, and where the potential was very great and has not come to fruition for what is, I think, the issue that needs discussion next, and that is the politics of all of this. The politics are very real. The politics are real within countries. To give you an example that some of us worked on a bit before, there's a lot of money for aid for trade with the beginning of the Doha round. But the rules of the World Bank and most donor agencies say they've got to deal with the finance ministry, and the finance ministry often doesn't release the funds that are meant for the Ministry of Trade. Very simple, but very real situation. And the real question is, do the African governments, who should have ownership of this, have the capacity to manage growth and development? What's interesting is there is a great deal more knowledge now about the successful elements of growth and the governments that have succeeded in growing very rapidly. Botswana is probably the best African example. The problem is, of course, there's no recipe. And they've all done it in quite different ways, congruent with their own circumstances. And therefore, having a government that has the capacity and the willingness to foment equitable growth is very important. Secondly, it seems to me there's a lot of implications here for whatever reforms emerge out of the U.S. aid program. I think that it's always been my view that Africa should be treated as a separable issue in terms of poverty and trade and development, simply because it contains the largest number of countries with a large portion of very poor people, even though globally, of course, it's a relatively small percentage of the world's poverty problem. But Africa demands, particularly if you're going to emphasize regional integration and regional trade and so on and so forth, a quite different perspective than having country-oriented programs and country missions and so on and so forth. You've got to look at it differently, and the legislation has got to allow you to do it. This was once done, by the way, with what some of you may remember was the Development Fund for Africa, where many of the restrictions on AID were released for programs in Africa. Unfortunately, the Clinton administration killed it. I do think what comes out of this meeting is a great potential for public-private partnerships. We met here with Pete's Coffee a few weeks ago, who are doing active technical assistance in their economic self-interest to help Tanzania and other East African farmers produce very high-grade coffee. And if you go into Pete's or go into the store to buy it, you'll see that there's an African brand of coffee they have now. And finally, I think Charlotte was right on. I think there's a great opportunity, no matter what happens to Doha, around a link trade facilitation, which is relatively uncontroversial with aid for trade. And I would hope when the new administration finally decides what it's going to do, that is a major part of what will be included in the QDDR. So thank you all very much for coming. It was a long session, but it was extremely rich, and I hope it was very useful. It certainly was for me. Thank you.